Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, is there a paper on your desk tonight still waiting to be signed? A truth you folded away rather than faced? Watson learned that a single altered page can carry the weight of 20 years. Do subscribe so no signature goes unread. Now lean closer, for as Holmes believed, no document lies so well that observation cannot unfold it. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. Link below. Chapter 1. The Orderly House at Ashcombe Close. Of the many singular dwellings into which my association with Sherlock Holmes carried me, I recall none so unsettling in its very orderliness as Ashcombe Close, the country residence of Sir Matthew Rooke, situated some 2 miles from the town of Guildford. It was not a grand house, nor an ancient one, but it possessed a quality of discipline so pronounced that a visitor felt himself entering not a home but an instrument, calibrated and wound to a single, unwavering purpose. I had occasion to reflect upon this as our trap turned in at the gates on a grey October morning, the beeches along the drive already stripped by early frosts. Holmes had said little during the journey down from Waterloo, contenting himself with a newspaper and an occasional glance at a telegram he had received but not yet shown me. It was only as the house came into view, its grey gables sharp against a paler sky, that he spoke. You will observe, Watson, that even the gravel has been raked in patterns too regular for a gardener's taste. There is a mind at work here that cannot tolerate disorder in anything, however small. Surely that speaks well of the household, I ventured. It speaks of something, said Holmes, though whether well or ill I cannot yet say. A love of order may spring from temperament, or it may spring from the necessity of concealing a single, well-buried irregularity beneath a mountain of scrupulous ones. We shall see which it is. We were received by a manservant of exact and noiseless movement, and shown into a study where a tall clock ticked with a precision that seemed almost an affront to the ordinary imprecision of life. Sir Matthew Rooke rose to greet us. He was a man of perhaps 65, silver-haired, upright, with the kind of face that juries are said to trust upon sight, though I had learned enough of Holmes's cases by then to distrust any face that trusted itself so thoroughly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a dry, firm hand, "you are prompt, which I confess relieves me. I am a man who values promptness above nearly every other virtue." "Above honesty, Sir Matthew," said Holmes, with that air of idle courtesy which I had come to recognise as anything but idle. Our host's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes recalibrated itself as a merchant's scales settle after an unexpected weight has been placed upon them. "I should hope the two need never be opposed," he said smoothly, and gestured us to chairs. He explained his errand without preamble, in the manner of a man accustomed to briefs rather than confidences. 3 days previous he had received, by the ordinary post, an envelope containing a single sheet of cheap paper, upon which had been pasted words cut from a newspaper. Sir Matthew produced it from a locked drawer and laid it before us. I read the message with a chill I could not entirely account for at the time. The witness has remembered which paper she signed. "You will know, gentlemen," Sir Matthew continued, "that a parliamentary inquiry has lately been reopened into the Blackthorn Junction fire, a disaster now 20 years old, in which 12 railway labourers lost their lives when a warehouse door was found secured against them. I prosecuted the case that followed. Caleb Wade, the foreman responsible for the doors, was convicted upon the testimony of a young booking clerk named Agnes Bell. It was, gentlemen, the case that made my name at the bar." "And Wade," I asked, "died in prison 11 years ago, still protesting his innocence as convicted men so often do." Sir Matthew said this with the weary patience of a man reciting a fact worn smooth by long handling. "The inquiry has summoned Agnes Bell, now matron of a convalescent home I was pleased to endow, to submit a fresh affidavit. It is to be delivered in 3 days' time. I believe someone means to interfere with it, to steal it, or worse, to alter it before it reaches the inquiry, so as to embarrass me, or the railway company, or both. Holmes had listened to this recitation with his fingertips together and his eyes half closed, a posture I knew to conceal the keenest attention. "You speak of the dead workers with evident feeling, Sir Matthew," he said at last, "and yet you have referred to Wade only as the foreman responsible for the doors, and, if I mistake not the phrase you used to my client's agent when you wrote requesting my services, as the necessary defendant. It is an odd form of words for a man one has convicted of manslaughter." Sir Matthew's composure held, but I saw his hand, resting upon the desk, close very slightly. A barrister does not choose his phrases for sentiment, Mr. Holmes, but for precision. Wade was necessary to the case because the case required a defendant, and the evidence pointed to him. "Just so," said Holmes softly. "And yet you have, I am told, founded and generously maintained no fewer than 3 charitable institutions for the relief of the Blackthorn victims' families, while refusing, upon every occasion it has been put to you, to support any reopening of Wade's conviction. It is curious, is it not, to labour so hard for the comfort of the bereaved, while resisting so firmly any inquiry into whether the man convicted of bereaving them was in fact guilty." For the first time, something like anger, or was it fear, flickered across our host's handsome features. "I didn't summon you here, Mr. Holmes, to have my character dissected, but to protect a document." "You summoned me," Holmes returned, rising, "because you require a man who observes closely, and you must forgive me if I cannot leave my faculties at the door along with my hat. I will take the case, Sir Matthew. Whether I take it upon quite the terms you imagine remains to be seen." We were shown to our rooms by the same silent manservant, and it was not until we stood alone in the corridor, our bags not yet unpacked, that Holmes spoke again, in a low voice meant for me alone. "A man may spend 20 years performing good deeds, Watson, not from kindness, but from the fear of one bad deed being discovered. I do not yet know which sort of man Sir Matthew Rook is, but I confess I have rarely met a client so anxious to protect a paper and so unwilling to be asked what is written upon it." I own that I did not then grasp the full weight of his words. It was only in the days that followed, as the orderly house at Ashcombe Close began to yield up its secrets one by one, that I understood how precisely Holmes had, within the hour of our arrival, taken the true measure of the man who had summoned us. Chapter 2. 5 Blameless People. Breakfast at Ashcombe Close was served at 8 o'clock precisely, and I remarked to Holmes as we descended that I had rarely stayed beneath a roof where the very act of eating seemed subject to jurisdiction. He smiled thinly but said nothing, for by then the household had begun to assemble, and each face that entered the dining room offered him, I could see, a fresh text to be read. Eleanor Rook came first. She was a striking young woman of perhaps 28, dark-browed, with none of her uncle's practised warmth, and a good deal more of what I can only call moral seriousness. She greeted us with a directness that I found refreshing after Sir Matthew's polished evasions. "You will have gathered, Mr. Holmes, that my uncle and I do not agree upon every subject," she said, taking her seat without ceremony. "I have told him to his face more than once that Caleb Wade's name ought to have been cleared years ago. He will not hear of it, but I would not have you think me indifferent to what such an exposure might cost. My uncle's charities support 40 families who have done nothing wrong. I should not like to see them ruined for the sake of a scandal, however justly deserved." "A scandal and a truth are not always the same expense," said Holmes. "No," she agreed, colouring slightly, "but they are sometimes billed to the same account." It was a shrewd answer, and I saw Holmes register it as such. We were joined shortly after by a young man introduced as Thomas Wade, son of the convicted foreman, whose presence at Ashcombe Close I confess surprised me, until Sir Matthew explained, with the air of a man displaying his own magnanimity, that he had invited Thomas down himself, that he might see for himself there was nothing here to hide. Thomas was a quiet, well-made fellow of 30 or so, with his father's broad hands and, I thought, a good deal of restraint sitting uneasily upon a temper not naturally restrained. "I want only the truth, Doctor," he said to me quietly, while Sir Matthew was occupied elsewhere. "My father died still saying he never touched that door. A man does not lie with his last breath, whatever else he may have done with his first 60 years. Holmes, who had drifted near enough to catch this, asked mildly, "And what do you believe happened, Mr. Wade?" "I believe someone else gave that order, and let my father hang for it in all but name," Thomas answered, and there was iron beneath the quiet. Agnes Bell arrived last of the household's visitors, and I own I had expected from Sir Matthew's account some figure of severe and settled respectability. What I found instead was a woman past 50, whose composure seemed maintained at some cost, whose eyes moved to corners of the room as though checking that the furniture had not altered in the night. She was matron now of one of Sir Matthew's convalescent homes, a position she held, she told us, with evident gratitude. For Sir Matthew took me in when no one else would have a girl who had given such evidence. "You have prepared your new affidavit for the inquiry?" Holmes asked her. "I have, sir. Mr. Fane has been most kind in helping me set it down properly." "And does it differ greatly from what you said at the trial?" A curious confusion passed over her features, there and gone like a cloud crossing a field. "I have only told what I remember, sir. I could not say how it compares with the other. I never saw the other paper read out in court. I was not permitted to remain in the room." It was a strange admission, and Holmes let it lie without comment, though I saw him mark it. Dr. Edwin Summers, Sir Matthew's physician, joined us for coffee, a stout, sensible man with none of the household's watchfulness about him, or so I judged at first, before I came to understand that his particular anxiety wore a different coat entirely. "Sir Matthew's heart is a good deal weaker than he permits the world to know," he told us frankly when Holmes inquired. "I have warned him repeatedly against strain of any kind. His medicine is kept under a lock in the study cabinet, digitalis, in measured doses, for his condition does not tolerate carelessness. Who holds the keys? Sir Matthew himself and Mr. Fane, who keeps a household set for emergencies. No one else, to my knowledge. It remained only to speak with Julian Fane, and here I confess my first impression was of a man almost too helpful to be interesting, a neat, grey, exact person of perhaps 45, who produced for Holmes, without the least hesitation, the entire register of documents held in the House Archive, together with a written list of every person who had entered it in the past month. "Sir Matthew's new affidavit from Miss Bell," he explained, "is sealed within the green dispatch box upon his study desk. I locked it there myself on Tuesday evening in his presence. You have served Sir Matthew a long while, Mr. Fane?" "Since I was 21, sir. Very nearly the whole of my working life." There was nothing in his manner that a barrister could have called evasive, and yet, walking with Holmes in the garden that afternoon, beneath a sky already threatening rain, I remarked that I had found the household on the whole disarmingly open. "They are all disarmingly open, Watson, and that is precisely what troubles me," said Holmes. 5 people, and each one answers every question put to him with perfect readiness, and each one, if you watch closely, grows uneasy at a different question, and for a different reason. Eleanor fears scandal. Thomas fears his own anger being mistaken for guilt. Agnes fears her own memory, which she cannot fully trust. Summers fears that some professional carelessness of his own may yet be found at the root of things. And Fane. He paused, frowning slightly at the middle distance. Fane fears disorder itself, as another man might fear the dark. And which of those fears points to guilt? None of them, and all of them, until we know more. He drew from his pocket a folded paper, the trial transcript procured, I later learned, by telegram before we had ever left London, and held it up against the fading light. "I spent an hour this evening with the Blackthorn proceedings, Watson, and made a discovery that I think will interest you more than anything yet said at that admirable breakfast table. Miss Bell's original affidavit and the statement read aloud in court open with nearly identical paragraphs. The same hour, the same weather, the same description of the smoke. But their conclusions could not differ more sharply. One declares that Caleb Wade himself locked the warehouse doors. The other states that a director of the railway company ordered them secured to prevent looting and that Wade merely obeyed. Then one of them is false. One of them must be, said Holmes, and a man went to prison and died there upon the strength of whichever one a jury believed. Chapter 3. Death Behind the Green Door. I have known few mornings so ill-suited to the news they brought as that which followed. A pale sun had broken through the clouds over Ashcombe Close, and the breakfast table, when Holmes and I came down, wore its usual air of unbending punctuality, save that the chair at its head stood empty. "Sir Matthew is not an early riser?" Holmes inquired of the manservant, whose name I had by then learned was Prescott. "On the contrary, sir, he is invariably the first at table. I have already sent to inquire." The inquiry, when it returned, was troubling. Sir Matthew's study door, which gave upon the passage beside the library, was locked from within, and no answer had come to repeated knocking. Julian Fane, summoned in haste, went pale beneath his usual grey composure, and after a moment's hesitation that I thought spoke more of shock than of guilt, ordered the door forced. It gave upon the third blow of Prescott's shoulder, and what we found within I shall not soon forget, though I have seen death in far crueler forms upon a dozen battlefields. Sir Matthew Rooke lay slumped in the chair before his writing desk, one hand fallen across the blotting pad, his face turned toward the cold hearth, as though he had looked once toward the fire, and thought better of rising to mend it. There was no wound, no sign of struggle. A glass of water stood at his elbow, together with a small bottle I recognised, from Dr. Summers' description of the day before as his heart medicine. A candle had burned down to little more than an inch of tallow and gone out unassisted. Dr. Summers, arriving within minutes in his shirt-sleeves, made a brief examination, and rose with the particular gravity of a man delivering a verdict he had half expected. His heart, I should say, without hesitation. I warned him against strain, a sudden seizure. It is precisely as I feared. Holmes said nothing for some while, but moved about the room with that quiet, unhurried thoroughness I had learned never to interrupt. He tried the French windows, which stood latched from the inside, their catches undisturbed by rust or recent handling. He measured the chimney's throat with his eye, and pronounced it, correctly, too narrow to have admitted a cat, let alone a man. The key to the study door itself he found precisely where it ought to have been, beneath Sir Matthew's still hand, as though it had fallen there in the moment of his collapse. Inspector Lestrade, summoned from Guildford and arriving with the brisk satisfaction of a man to whom a case has been handed already solved, surveyed the room and delivered his conclusion within the quarter hour. "A locked room, Mr. Holmes, a weak heart, and a key beneath the dead man's hand. I do not think we need trouble ourselves overmuch as to how he died. Whatever mischief was intended with his papers must have been done before he locked himself in for the night." For it was the papers, in the end, that gave the room its darker character. The green dispatch box that Fane had described to us stood open upon the desk, its lock unforced, its lid thrown back. Within lay a single sheet, folded twice, bearing Agnes Bell's signature at the foot, but it was not, Fane confirmed within moments of examining it, the new affidavit he had himself locked away on Tuesday evening. It was, instead, a copy of her original testimony of 20 years before, the very document that had sent Caleb Wade to prison. The true affidavit, the fresh statement intended for the parliamentary inquiry, was nowhere to be found. "You perceive the difficulty, Lestrade," said Holmes, at last breaking his long silence. "A locked door, undisturbed windows, and a paper switched for another before that door was ever locked. The exchange, at least, must have been accomplished while Sir Matthew was yet abroad in the house, or asleep, or otherwise unwatching." "Precisely my own reading of it," said Lestrade, with the comfortable air of a man agreeing with himself. But I had watched Holmes's eye travel, again and again, not to the door nor the windows nor even the dispatch box, but to the desk itself, and I knew that particular stillness in him too well to mistake it for satisfaction. "You will observe," he said presently, addressing no one and everyone, "that the medicine bottle stands returned to precisely its accustomed place. Dr. Summers, I think you told us it is always kept at the desk's right-hand corner, some 4 inches from the blotting pad's edge." "That is so," said Summers, frowning. "And there it stands to the inch. A man dying of a sudden seizure does not, as a rule, pause to restore his medicine to its exact former position before the attack overtakes him, nor indeed after, for by then he's beyond such courtesies. And yet here is Sir Matthew's pen, an excellent gold-nibbed instrument that I should judge cost him a guinea, if it cost him a farthing, lying uncapped and rolling gently against the blotting pad, its ink already dried upon the nib. A man careful enough to align a medicine bottle to the inch is not, in my experience, a man who abandons an expensive pen to spoil itself upon his desk. The two facts do not belong to the same character, gentlemen, nor, I think, to the same hour." Lestrade shifted, plainly unconvinced but unwilling to argue the point before Sir Matthew's body had been carried out. "A dying man's habits are not to be read like a railway timetable, Mr. Holmes." "Perhaps not," said Holmes, "though I have generally found them more reliable." He bent once more over the dispatch box, drawing out the false affidavit and holding it to the light. "This paper, you will note, has been folded twice. A small, deliberate fold of the kind a man makes when he wishes a document to fit a pocket or a hand or a hiding place too narrow for a flat sheet. And yet the dispatch box itself is a full 9 inches by 6, quite large enough to hold the paper flat, as I am assured Miss Bell's genuine affidavit was placed within it on Tuesday. Why fold a paper twice to lay it flat in a box built to receive it unfolded?" No one answered him, and he did not, at that hour, press for an answer. "This was not an act of passion, Watson," he said to me quietly, as we withdrew at last to let Lestrade's men about their grim business. "A man in the grip of sudden anger does not think to fold a paper for concealment, nor to leave a pen precisely where it will be noticed, nor to restore a medicine bottle to its accustomed inch, while abandoning every other courtesy of a tidy desk. Someone arranged both the paper and the death according to a design, and designs, my dear fellow, are made by minds, not by moments." Chapter 4. A Motive for Every Conscience. By noon the house had settled into that peculiar hush which follows a death not yet understood, a hush broken only by the tread of Lestrade's constables, and the low murmur of a household rehearsing, each to himself, the account he would presently be asked to give. Holmes spent the interval closeted with Fane's registers, and it was not until we sat down together in the small library that he consented to lay before me the several motives which the morning's inquiries had uncovered, each one, as he remarked, sufficient in itself to hang a lesser mystery upon. "Consider first the niece," said he, ticking the point upon his finger. "Eleanor Rook inherits Ashcombe Close, and, I should imagine, the greater part of the estate that surrounds it. And yet Fane tells me Sir Matthew drew up a new will not 3 weeks since, placing the bulk of his fortune under Fane's own administration in trust for the very charities Eleanor herself professes to value above her uncle's reputation. A young woman who quarrelled openly with her uncle, and who stood to see her inheritance diminished by a stroke of his pen, is not without cause for resentment. You do not think her capable of it. I think a great many people capable of a great many things, Watson, which is why I decline to found a case upon capability alone. Consider next young Wade, who has sworn, publicly and more than once, if the newspapers of 18 months past are to be trusted, that he would see the man responsible for his father's conviction exposed whatever the cost. He is here, in this house, at Sir Matthew's own invitation, within reach of the very papers in dispute. And Agnes Bell? Miss Bell, said Holmes, stands to lose a great deal should it emerge that her 2 affidavits contradict one another so utterly. A charge of perjury is no light matter, even against a woman who acted, I suspect, more from confusion than from malice. Fear is as potent a motive as greed, and considerably more common. Summers, then, seems the least likely of the 5, I ventured. He has nothing to gain from Sir Matthew's death, and everything to lose should any irregularity in the medicine be traced to his own prescribing. You reason well, though not, I think, quite far enough, A man who fears disgrace through carelessness has as much cause to conceal a fact as a man who fears disgrace through malice. The emotion is identical, whatever the underlying truth. And then, Holmes continued, there is Fane, who has held the keys to every document in this house for 20 years, who could, I do not doubt, conceal or produce almost any paper he chose without arousing the smallest suspicion. So thoroughly is his diligence woven into the fabric of the place. He fell silent a moment, turning over in his long fingers a small fragment he had drawn from his waistcoat pocket. A sliver of red sealing wax, no larger than a thumbnail, which he had found, he told me, caught in the weave of the carpet beneath the chair in which Thomas Wade had sat the previous evening. There is our first fragment of physical fact amid so much motive, he said. Red wax, Watson, of a shade I have not yet matched to any seal in this house. Though Fane assures me Sir Matthew's private correspondence is invariably sealed in black. We shall want to learn where red wax is kept at Ashcombe Close, and by whom. Other fragments, gathered through the morning's quiet inquiries, presented themselves in similar disorder. Agnes Bell, questioned gently by Lestrade, admitted without prompting that she had entered the study the previous evening, shortly before dinner, to ask Sir Matthew a small question concerning my affidavit, which he answered kindly enough, and then I left him. Eleanor, for her part, confessed to having burned a letter in her bedroom grate that same night. A letter from her uncle, she said, of a private nature, which I had no wish to see fall under a stranger's eye, though she would not be drawn further upon its contents. And Dr. Summers, checking his medicine cabinet at Holmes's request, discovered that one of the 2 keys, his own, kept ordinarily upon his watch chain, had been briefly unaccounted for on the previous afternoon, mislaid, he believed, during his rounds of the convalescent wing, and recovered again before nightfall. A fine tangle, I said, as we walked afterward in the bare garden, the gravel crunching underfoot in patterns Holmes had already pronounced too regular for comfort. 5 people, 5 motives, and a scattering of clues that might belong to any one of them, or to none of them, said Holmes, which is very often the more instructive possibility. I have long held, Watson, that motive is the least reliable of all a detective's instruments, for it may be discovered in almost any human heart if one digs deep enough. I prefer, where I am able, to ask a different question of each suspect, not what he might have wished, but what he expected to happen once Sir Matthew was dead. And what did you learn? That Eleanor expected the parliamentary inquiry to proceed regardless of her uncle's death, and spoke of it this morning as a settled certainty, before ever a word had passed as to whether the true affidavit might yet be lost. That Thomas expected the missing document to be found. Indeed, he asked Lestrade directly whether a search of the grounds had yet been ordered, a question that presupposes the paper still exists to be searched for. That Agnes expected, above all else, that the inquiry itself might now be abandoned altogether, and seemed almost relieved at the prospect. That Summers expected a post-mortem examination, and asked for one before Lestrade had so much as suggested it, and that Fane— Holmes paused, and I saw in his pause something closer to genuine puzzlement than I had yet observed in him upon this case. Fane alone, of the 5, spoke as though the false affidavit in the dispatch box might yet be accepted as genuine by the inquiry, should no one trouble to examine it too closely. It was a small thing, a turn of phrase merely, but it was there. Then Fane knew the paper was false. He knew, or he guessed, or he supposed it likely enough to speak carelessly, said Holmes. Expectation may reveal knowledge, Watson, but knowledge is not yet guilt, and I have been wrong before in mistaking the one for the other. We must learn a good deal more of what each of these 5 blameless people truly is before I permit myself the luxury of certainty. The afternoon light was already failing as we returned indoors, and I confess that I, for one, could not shake the sense that Ashcombe Close, for all its clocks and ribbons and ordered registers, had kept its most disordered secret locked away far longer than any dispatch box, and meant, if it could, to keep it locked still. Chapter 5. The Behaviour of Innocence. Holmes declined that evening to interrogate anyone. It was a decision that puzzled Lestrade, who had arranged his notebook and pencil upon the drawing-room table, with the evident intention of questioning the household one by one, in the manner sanctioned by long custom and, I dare say, by considerable success. You will get more from these people over sherry than ever you would across a table, Lestrade, Holmes told him. A guilty man braces himself against a question. He has no defence prepared against a remark. And so it was that the household gathered at Holmes's quiet suggestion, in the long drawing-room after dinner, an assembly made stranger by the black-draped mirror above the mantel and the untouched chair that had been Sir Matthew's, and Holmes moved among them with a cup of coffee in his hand, and, to any eye but mine, no purpose whatever beyond idle conversation. He came first to Eleanor, who sat somewhat apart from the others near the window, her dark head bent over the needlework she did not appear to be advancing. "I have been wondering, Miss Rook," said Holmes, settling into the chair beside her as though the thought had only that moment occurred to him, "whether your uncle intended before his death to make some manner of confession. There is a phrase in a letter of his, I shall not trouble you with where I found it, that suggests a man preparing to unburden himself." I watched her face with some care, for I had learned by then to trust Holmes's instinct for the revealing moment above almost any other evidence. What I saw was not grief nor alarm, but something that passed so swiftly across her features that I might have doubted it, had I not seen it also register, a heartbeat later, in Holmes's own sharpening glance. Relief, plain and unguarded, gone again before she'd fully drawn breath to answer. "I should be glad to think so," she said carefully. "Whatever else my uncle was, I should not wish to think him incapable of it." "You quarrelled with him, I understand, over Caleb Wade." "I quarrelled with him over a great many things, Mr. Holmes, but never once over money, if that is what you are circling toward. I have told him to his face that I would rather see every penny of the Blackthorn charities pass from our name entirely than see them stand as a monument to a wrong we would not right." She resumed her needlework with a hand I noticed did not tremble. "You may draw from that whatever conclusion suits your purpose." Holmes drew, I think, precisely the conclusion he had hoped for, that her quarrel with her uncle had been one of conscience rather than of inheritance, though he offered her no sign of it, and moved on before she could observe the passing of his interest. With Thomas Wade he was less gentle, though I believe now the roughness was itself deliberate. "It has occurred to me, Mr. Wade," he remarked, apparently addressing the fire, "that your father may, after all, have been guilty as charged. 20 years is a long while for a family to nurse a certainty that the world at large never shared." The young man's colour rose at once, and for a moment I thought he would answer with more heat than sense, but his eyes, moving instinctively about the room, found Agnes Bell where she sat near the door, and I saw the anger check itself, transform, and emerge instead as something closer to shame. "I beg your pardon, Miss Bell," he said, low and quick. "I did not mean to speak so near you. It is an old wound, and it is not yours to bear alone." Agnes murmured something indistinct in reply, and Holmes, watching this small exchange, said afterward to me, when we had withdrawn a little apart, "That is not the anger of a man rehearsing a part, Watson. It is too uncontrolled, too immediately ashamed of itself. A man capable of the design we saw in that study this morning would not permit his temper to slip its leash before witnesses." It was with Agnes herself that Holmes practised his most delicate deception. He quoted to her, as though from memory, a line he attributed to her own affidavit, a line, I later learned, subtly altered from the true wording, describing the hour at which the warehouse doors were said to have been secured. "No, sir," she said at once, and with more certainty than she had shown upon any other point that day. "It was not so late as that. I remember the church clock had not yet struck the half-hour when I saw the doors made fast. I have never forgotten the sound of that bell, sir, not in 20 years. "You correct me on the hour," said Holmes gently, "but not on the manner of the telling. I had also misquoted, I confess, the precise legal form in which your words were afterward recorded." She looked at him with plain incomprehension. "I don't know how such things are set down for the courts, Mr. Holmes. I only know what I saw." "Just so," said Holmes, and I understood, though she did not, that he had confirmed something of importance, that her memory of the fire itself remained clear and unshaken after 2 decades, while her understanding of how that memory had been shaped into evidence was, and had perhaps always been, a country foreign to her. Dr. Summers, he tested more directly, producing the medicine bottle from the study and asking him to examine it once more beneath the lamp. Summers took it without hesitation, uncorked it, and frowned almost at once. "This is not mixed to the strength I prescribed," he said. "It is a heavier dose by a considerable margin. I should like this bottle sent for proper analysis without delay, Mr. Holmes, and I will say so to Inspector Lestrade myself." There was no calculation in his manner that I could detect, only the brisk alarm of a professional man confronted with an error he feared, rightly or wrongly, might be laid at his own door. It was Fane, in the end, who gave Holmes the smallest and, as it proved, the most telling reaction of the evening. Holmes had taken up, quite carelessly, one of the household's ledgers from a side table, and in setting it down again allowed its cover to bend sharply at one corner. Fane, who had stood silent and composed through every other exchange of the night, crossed the room in 3 swift steps and straightened the offending page with both hands, smoothing it flat as tenderly as another man might have soothed a frightened animal. "I beg your pardon," he said, colouring faintly at his own haste. "I am not accustomed to seeing papers handled so." "No," said Holmes, watching him with an interest he did not trouble to disguise. "I do not think you are." Later that night, as we sat together over the last of the fire, Holmes turned to me with a question that seemed, at first, to belong to philosophy rather than to detection. "Do you suppose, Watson, that remorse can become a form of loyalty?" I considered it. I suppose a guilty man might serve, all his life, the person he had wronged in some attempt to make amends he can never fully complete. "Or," said Holmes softly, staring into the coals, "he might serve, all his life, the man who made him guilty in the first place, mistaking obedience for penance, until the two have grown so entwined that he can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins." He said no more that night, but I did not think he had spoken idly, and I confess I slept the worse for wondering which of Ashcombe Close's 5 blameless people he had in mind. Chapter 6. The History Beneath the Signature. Morning found Holmes already at work in the small library, the Blackthorn trial papers spread before him in a fan of yellowed foolscap when I came down to breakfast. He had, gathered, sent overnight to London for certain records held by the railway company's solicitors, and these too now lay open upon the table, their seals broken, their margins marked here and there in his own small decisive hand. "Sit down, Watson, and let me put before you the history that lies beneath Agnes Bell's signature," said he, without looking up. "I believe I have it whole at last, though I shall want your patience while I set the pieces in their order." I drew up a chair, and he began in the manner I had come to know so well, laying each fact before me as a card is laid upon a table, face upward, so that the pattern might build itself beneath our eyes. 20 years ago, Agnes Bell was a booking clerk of 19, employed at the Blackthorn Junction warehouse office. On the night of the fire, she was at her post later than her ordinary hour, owing to some confusion over a consignment of goods, and from the window of the booking office she had a clear view across the yard to the warehouse doors. What she saw, Watson, was this: a director of the railway company, a man named Calder, whom I have traced through these very papers, giving an order to Caleb Wade that the doors be secured, that the warehouse's contents might not be plundered, amid the confusion of a small fire already smouldering among some stacked crates. Wade obeyed him, as a foreman obeys a director. Neither man, I think, foresaw how swiftly that small fire would spread, nor that 12 of their fellows would be trapped within by the very order meant to protect the company's goods. Then Wade was innocent. Wade was an instrument, which the law is generally reluctant to distinguish from a cause. Agnes gave a truthful account of what she had witnessed, to Julian Fane in the first instance, who was then a junior clerk in Sir Matthew's chambers, newly appointed and, I should imagine, glad of any confidence his employer chose to repose in him. Sir Matthew, upon hearing her account, understood at once that the truth, honestly presented, would ruin not only Calder but the company that employed him, and a good many investors of considerable standing besides. A conviction of Caleb Wade, a foreman without friends in the city, would satisfy the coroner's jury and trouble no one of consequence. And so the affidavit was altered. Fane was instructed to prepare a second version, one suggesting that Wade had acted upon his own authority, without any order from above. Agnes, distressed by the inquest, unpractised in the ways of lawyers, and trusting absolutely in the young clerk who had first taken her statement, was persuaded to sign what she believed were merely corrections of form. The final page of her true account, the page naming Calder, was quietly replaced with a page of Fane's careful drafting. She has told us herself, Watson, that she never saw the document read aloud in court, and never fully understood how the words she had spoken were transformed into the words a jury heard. I sat back, turning this over. But why should Fane consent to such a thing? You have described him as a man devoted, almost pathologically, to order and to correctness. Surely falsifying evidence stands as far from that character as any act could. I asked myself the same question through the small hours of this morning, said Holmes, and I believe I have the answer, though I shall want it confirmed before I speak of it openly. Fane's late father, it appears, was involved in a financial irregularity some years before his son entered Sir Matthew's service. A matter never made public, but known, I think, to Sir Matthew through some earlier professional connection. Sir Matthew held that knowledge over the young clerk's head, Watson, as a man holds a debt he has no intention of forgiving. Exposed the affidavit as false, and Fane's father's name, and with it I should imagine Fane's mother's remaining comfort, would have been dragged through the same mire. Fane obeyed, not from wickedness, but from a threat he had no power to resist. And afterward, gentlemen of conscience do what gentlemen of conscience so often do when the wrong they have committed cannot be undone. They seek to balance it by other means. Sir Matthew founded his charities. Fane, I have confirmed through certain private accounts I persuaded him, not without difficulty, to show me this morning, has for 11 years sent money, never large sums but regular ones, to Wade's surviving family, under a name that is not his own, and Agnes accepted the position Sir Matthew offered her at his convalescent home, and has spent 20 years, I think, telling herself that gratitude and guilt are not the same emotion, though she has never fully believed it. 3 people, I said slowly, each living inside the consequences of the same deception, for 20 years, without one of them ever speaking the whole truth aloud. Until, perhaps 3 days ago, said Holmes, when someone determined that it should be spoken at last, or determined, more precisely, that it must never be spoken at all. He rose then, and from the desk drew a sheet of plain paper, upon which he had, with evident care, reproduced in his own hand something resembling the missing affidavit, a harmless imitation, folded as the false document had been folded, and set down among a small scattering of other papers as though mislaid. I mean to leave this where Fane will find it, he told me, and to say nothing whatever of its origin. The test, when it came that afternoon, was swiftly and silently accomplished. Fane, passing through the library upon some errand of his own, paused at the sight of the papers, drew the imitation toward him, and within moments set it aside with the small, precise frown of a man identifying a forgery he need not even trouble to read. "This is not genuine, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The filing mark is wrong. It wants the private archives numbering, which runs in red ink along the upper margin, not black." Holmes had not at any point mentioned to him that such filing marks existed. "You know the archives marks very intimately, Mr. Fane," said Holmes, with no accusation in his tone, only observation. "I have kept them for 20 years, sir," Fane answered, and something passed behind his grey eyes that I could not then read, though I believe now it was the first true fear I had seen in him. "It proves," Holmes said to me afterward, as we walked once more in the bare garden, "that Fane possesses knowledge of both versions of that old affidavit more exact and more current than any innocent bystander could claim. It does not prove that he killed Sir Matthew. Knowledge of a wrong is not the same as the will to commit a second one in its defence, and I have been too often mistaken in assuming the two must travel together. We had scarcely returned to the house when Lestrade met us in the hall, his manner unusually subdued for a man who so rarely doubted his own conclusions. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "Thomas Wade has asked to speak with me, alone and at once. I think, from his manner, that he means to confess." Chapter 7. A confession that pleases everyone. Thomas Wade made his confession in the small study that had been Sir Matthew's, standing rather than seated, his hands loosed at his sides in the manner of a man who has rehearsed a speech so often in solitude that its delivery, when it comes at last, feels almost a relief. Lestrade sat with his notebook open. Holmes stood near the window saying nothing, and I took my place a little apart as I had learned to do upon such occasions, that I might observe without appearing to intrude. "I entered this room shortly before midnight," Thomas began, "using a key I found in the morning room. Miss Rook's, though she didn't know I had taken it, nor that she had left it there at all. I had seen her set it down that afternoon and forgot to think more of it until the house had gone quiet." "Continue," said Lestrade, pencil moving. "I meant only to read the new affidavit, Miss Bell's affidavit, before it went to the inquiry. I wished to know, once and for all, what she had truly set down, without a lawyer's hand between her words and mine. I found the green box unlocked upon the desk. I took the paper out, and I confess, Inspector, that once I held it, I could not bring myself to leave it there to be handled again by men I no longer trusted. I put the old copy, a copy I had found among Sir Matthew's private papers on an earlier occasion, out of nothing more than curiosity, into the box in its place, folded as I had carried it, and I kept the true affidavit." "Where is it now?" Lestrade asked. "I will not say," said Thomas, and for the first time his composure faltered, though not, I thought, from any calculation. "I acted foolishly, and I will answer for the offence, but I will not see the paper used again until I am satisfied it will be used honestly." "And Sir Matthew?" Holmes asked quietly from the window. Thomas's jaw tightened. "He came upon me before I had left the room. We spoke. I will not pretend it was spoken gently on either side. I told him what I'd done and why, and he grew angry, and then, all at once, he clutched at his chest and ordered me from the room in a voice I did not think a dying man could summon. I left him alive, Mr. Holmes. I swear it before God. But I have not slept since, for fear that the quarrel itself was enough to kill him." There was a silence in the room of the kind that follows a confession, which explains, almost too neatly, every question that has troubled an investigation. Lestrade closed his notebook with an air of quiet satisfaction that he did not trouble to disguise. "It is a clear enough account," he said, as we withdrew a little later to confer among ourselves. "Motive, opportunity, and a very plain admission of the document's removal. As for the locked door, it presents no difficulty whatever. Sir Matthew, once alone, could easily have turned the key himself before the seizure took him, whether from agitation at the quarrel or from the ordinary progress of his own weak heart. I am satisfied, Mr. Holmes, that we have the truth of it at last, however unhappy a truth it proves. It was, I confess, a conclusion I found myself almost relieved to accept. The household, when the confession was made known to them that evening, received it with an unmistakable easing of tension that no one troubled to conceal. Agnes Bell begged, with tears standing plainly in her eyes, that no further investigation be pressed. For the poor young man has suffered enough already through no fault of his own making, and I could not bear to see more misery come of this. Eleanor spoke of the charities, and of the harm a prolonged inquiry might yet do them, with a firmness that suggested she had already resolved, in her own mind, that the matter was closed. Dr. Summers, for his part, allowed that a sudden and severe agitation might indeed produce the effect he had observed, and did not press further his earlier insistence upon a full analysis of the medicine. Even I, walking with Holmes in the last grey light of that evening, felt the pull of a solution so complete, so evidently sufficient to every fact we had gathered that I said as much aloud. "It does explain a great deal, Holmes. The missing affidavit, the false one substituted in its place, the quarrel that might account for the strain upon his heart, even the locked door, if we allow that Sir Matthew turned the key himself once Thomas had gone." "It explains a great deal," Holmes agreed, though there was in his voice none of the settled satisfaction I heard in my own. "That is precisely what troubles me about it, Watson. I have observed, over a good many years of this curious trade, that the truth is rarely so obliging as to explain everything at once, in a single unbroken narrative, delivered freely by the very man it condemns. Thomas Wade confesses like a man accepting a punishment he believes he deserves, not like a man describing, in the plain and halting manner of memory, something he has actually done." "You think him innocent, then, of Sir Matthew's death?" "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that there are confessions made to escape justice, and confessions made to prevent justice from looking in the right direction, and that the two can wear, upon the surface, an identical face. Thomas Wade has told Lestrade a story that satisfies every party in this house at once. Miss Bell is spared the inquiry she dreads. Miss Rook's charities are spared a scandal. Dr. Summers is spared the burden of his own possible error. And Fane—" He paused, and I saw his eyes narrow very slightly upon the darkening line of the hedge before us. "Fane is spared any further scrutiny of an archive he alone can truly read. You believe the confession is false? I believe it is incomplete, which in matters of this kind so often amounts to the same falsehood, dressed in more honest clothing. A confession that pleases every soul in a household, Watson, is a confession I have learned to distrust, precisely in proportion to the relief it produces." We walked on some way in silence, the last light failing behind the black line of the beeches, and I found that my own relief of an hour before had begun, under the quiet pressure of his doubt, to curdle slowly into unease. Chapter 8. 2 holes in the margin. Holmes was at the study desk before the household had stirred the following morning, the false affidavit spread beneath the strong north light that fell across the blotting pad, a lens in his hand and an expression upon his face that I recognised at once as the particular stillness of a man who has found what he sought and is now determined not to disturb it by so much as a breath. "Come and look at this, Watson," he said, without turning, "and tell me what you make of it." I bent over the paper as he directed and saw, near the inner margin where the fold creased the sheet, 2 minute perforations, scarcely larger than pinpricks, all but hidden within the crease itself. Holmes drew the lens closer, and I made out, caught within each tiny hole, a faint thread of blue. "Silk," said Holmes, "and not the sort a haberdasher sells by the yard. I noticed it first yesterday evening, but I would not speak of it until I had confirmed its meaning." He rang for Fane, who arrived within minutes, and to whom Holmes put the question directly, holding the paper out for his inspection without preamble. "Mr. Fane, I must ask you to explain these marks to me, and I must ask you to be entirely candid, for a good deal now depends upon your answer." Fane took the paper with visible reluctance, turned it to the light, and I watched the colour drain slowly from his face as he studied the small perforations near the fold. "They are stitching holes, Mr. Holmes," he said at last, in a voice that had lost, for the first time since our arrival, its accustomed evenness. Sir Matthew's private duplicate records, the archive copies, kept for his own reference and never intended for any court or inquiry, are bound together with blue filing cord, stitched through the upper margin in bundles of a dozen sheets or so. Parliamentary affidavits, by contrast, are never pierced at all. They are secured only with red tape, tied loosely about the folded document, that the seal beneath might remain undisturbed for examination. "Then this paper," said Holmes, "the very paper found within the green dispatch box beside Sir Matthew's body, did not come from any file intended for the inquiry. It came from the private archive, from a bundle that had been stitched, and from which it was afterward unstitched, that it might be removed. It could have come from nowhere else, said Fane. I keep those bundles myself, Mr. Holmes. I know their stitching as I know my own hand. And who has access to that archive? Sir Matthew and I. No other person in this house or beyond it has ever possessed a key. Holmes set the paper down with great care as a man sets down something he does not wish to break by handling. You perceive, Watson, what this small discovery accomplishes. Thomas Wade told us he removed the true affidavit from the dispatch box and replaced it with a copy he claims to have found at some earlier date among Sir Matthew's private papers out of nothing more than curiosity. But a paper unstitched from a locked archive to which only 2 men in this house held the key cannot have passed through Thomas Wade's hands in the manner he describes, not unless he also possessed a key to that archive, which Mr. Fane assures us he did not, and which no search of his belongings has discovered. Then his confession is false, I said. His confession is incomplete, as I told you last evening it must be, said Holmes. He believes he removed the true affidavit and replaced it with a forgery of his own finding. I don't doubt that he entered this room, nor that he quarrelled with Sir Matthew, nor even that he took away with him some document he believed to be the truth. But the false affidavit that greeted us in that box, Watson, the one stitched from the private archive and unstitched again before it was folded to fit a pocket, that could only have been placed there by a hand with access to the archive itself, and set down beforehand, I think, in expectation of exactly the confrontation that followed. You mean that someone anticipated Thomas Wade's visit? More than anticipated it. Someone arranged for it to explain a death already planned. Holmes rose and paced the length of the desk, his hands clasped behind him in the attitude I had learned to associate with the final assembling of a case already all but solved. Consider the fold once more. The paper was pierced while it lay flat within its bundle. That much the stitching holes make plain, for they run true and straight, as no fold could produce if the piercing came after. It was unstitched, and only then folded twice, small enough to be slipped into a coat pocket, or to appear to have been carried there by a man in haste. It was prepared, Watson, not merely to deceive the inquiry, but to fit precisely the shape of Thomas Wade's confession before that confession was ever spoken aloud. I confess the full weight of this did not settle upon me until Holmes turned next to the medicine bottle which he had kept, wrapped in a handkerchief, in a drawer of his own room since the morning of Sir Matthew's death. Dr. Summers's analysis arrived by the first post, he said, drawing out a folded telegram. The digitalis in this bottle was mixed to a strength very nearly 3 times that which Sir Matthew's ordinary dose required, sufficient in a man of his known condition to produce a fatal effect within the hour, and sufficient also to be readily concealed beneath the appearance of a natural seizure, particularly if that seizure followed hard upon some hour of genuine agitation. Such as a quarrel with Thomas Wade. Such as a quarrel that someone knew was coming, and had, I believe, done a good deal to encourage. Holmes folded the telegram away again. Sir Matthew did not die of a weak heart alone, Watson, whatever comfort that explanation offered to 5 troubled consciences last evening. He was murdered, deliberately and with considerable care, by a hand that understood both his medicine and his private archive well enough to turn each of them, in turn, against him. He crossed to the bell-pull and rang for Lestrade, who arrived some minutes later still buttoning his coat against the morning chill, his earlier satisfaction plainly not yet dislodged. "I must ask you, Lestrade, to gather the household once more in this room," said Holmes, "for I believe we are at last in a position to say who killed Sir Matthew Rooke, and why a young man's confession, however honestly meant, cannot be permitted to stand in the place of the truth." Chapter 9. The Secretary's Last Correction. The household assembled once more in the study, the same room in which Sir Matthew had been found, and I do not think any of us who entered it that morning could quite forget the chair by the writing desk, though it stood empty now and had been set carefully back into its accustomed place. Eleanor took a seat near the cold hearth. Thomas Wade stood, as he had stood throughout his confession, near the door, as though he could not yet decide whether he belonged among the accused or the accusers. Agnes Bell sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Summers remained near the window. Julian Fane took his usual place beside the desk, among the registers and ledgers that had for 20 years been the whole visible substance of his devotion. Holmes stood before them all and began, as was his custom, not with an accusation, but with a history. 20 years ago, he said, Agnes Bell witnessed the truth of the Blackthorn Junction fire and told that truth honestly to a young clerk who had only lately entered Sir Matthew Rook's service. That clerk was instructed to alter her account, that a railway director's negligence might be concealed and a foreman's ruin substituted in its place. He obeyed, not from any wickedness of his own, but because Sir Matthew held over him a threat concerning his late father's affairs, a threat that would have left the young clerk's mother destitute had he refused. I do not say this to excuse what followed. I say it only because a full account of guilt is worth nothing if it omits the manner of its beginning. Fane had gone very still, his grey eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window, and I saw his hands resting upon the desk's edge, tighten slowly upon the polished wood. For 20 years, Holmes continued, 3 people carried the weight of that single deception in 3 different ways. Sir Matthew built charities upon it and grew rich and celebrated in the building. Agnes Bell accepted a position of trust from the very man who had used her, and told herself, I think, that gratitude might yet stand in the place of the truth she could not undo. And Julian Fane made secret and regular payments, under a name not his own, to the surviving family of the man his forgery had helped to convict, a restitution he could never speak of, and could never complete. "You need not spare me, Mr. Holmes," said Fane very quietly. "I know what I did." "I am coming to what you did more recently," said Holmes, "which is a different matter and a graver one. When the parliamentary inquiry reopened the Blackthorn case, Sir Matthew found himself facing a danger he had held at bay for 20 years. He resolved, I believe, to preserve his own reputation by a partial confession, one that would name Julian Fane as the man whose misguided loyalty had caused the substitution of evidence, while omitting entirely the threat by which that loyalty had first been compelled. I have here. He drew from his pocket the charred fragment Eleanor had surrendered to him that morning, recovered in part from her bedroom grate, the remains of a letter in which Sir Matthew set down very nearly those words. He meant to appear a remorseful gentleman, while sacrificing the one man who had served him most faithfully. A sound escaped Agnes Bell, though whether of grief or of understanding I could not tell. "Fane discovered the plan," Holmes went on. "I do not know by what means, and I do not think it greatly matters. Perhaps he came upon the letter before Eleanor burned it. Perhaps Sir Matthew, in some moment of cruelty or carelessness, told him outright. What matters is that a man who had spent 20 years making silent restitution for a single coerced act now faced the prospect of standing before the world as its sole author, its willing architect, while the man who had truly compelled him passed into history as a repentant hero. It was, I think, a prospect he found he could not endure." Fane had not moved, nor spoken, but his silence now carried a different quality than before. The silence, I thought, of a man who has ceased to defend himself, and begun, instead, simply to listen to his own history being read aloud by a stranger. "Knowing that Thomas Wade intended to confront Sir Matthew that night," Holmes continued, "you altered his medicine beforehand, Mr. Fane, mixing the digitalis to a strength you knew would prove fatal within the hour, and trusting that the excitement of the coming quarrel would disguise its true cause. You then removed a page from the private archive, a page bearing Agnes Bell's original damning testimony, unstitched it from its bundle, folded it small enough to seem carried in a man's pocket, and placed it within the green dispatch box in place of the true affidavit, which you had already secured. Thomas Wade's anger, which you knew to be genuine and therefore convincing, would explain both the death and the missing document, and no one would think to look further than the confession he was certain, sooner or later, to offer. "I did not know he would confess so completely," Fane said, and his voice, when it came at last, was low and very tired. "I thought only that suspicion would fall upon him, and that it would end there in doubt, as such things so often do. I did not intend that he should hang for what I had done." "And yet you permitted his confession to stand unchallenged for a full day and night," said Holmes, "which is a fault I do not think you will find easy to set beside the rest of your restitution." Fane said nothing to this. Lestrade, at Holmes's quiet direction, went to the door of the small anteroom where Fane's document case had been placed under guard since the previous evening, and returned with a single sealed envelope, drawn from between two sheets of ordinary blotting paper where it had been concealed. "The true affidavit, Lestrade," said Holmes, "which Mr. Fane took not from the dispatch box but from Thomas Wade's own room, while the household slept and suspicion had already settled where we wished it to rest." Fane did not deny the reasoning, nor did he attempt at any point to dispute a single fact Holmes had laid before him. Instead, he looked up, and there was in his grey eyes something that was neither defiance nor despair, but a kind of weary clarity, as of a man setting down a burden he has carried so long that its absence feels for a moment almost like pain. "Sir Matthew ruined Caleb Wade," he said. "He manipulated Agnes Bell, and he coerced me, and then, when the truth threatened to reach him at last, he sought to emerge from it a repentant hero at my expense. I do not ask you to forgive what I did, Mr. Holmes. I ask only that it be understood." "I do understand it," said Holmes, and there was no coldness in his voice as he said it. "You were once placed in a cruel position, Mr. Fane, and that explains, if it does not excuse the first surrender of your conscience, it does not excuse the second. Sir Matthew used the law to conceal his guilt. You have answered him by using your own guilt to imitate justice. An imitation, however earnestly meant, is not the thing itself." Fane was arrested within the hour for the murder of Sir Matthew Rooke, and for the destruction and substitution of evidence intended for a parliamentary inquiry. Holmes insisted, before Lestrade's men had so much as led him from the house, that the full history of Sir Matthew's coercion, 20 years old and newly uncovered, be set down in the official report beside the record of his crime, that whatever judgment the law pronounced upon Julian Fane, it should pronounce it upon the whole truth, and not upon the fragment that suited the comfort of the living. Chapter 10. Law, Mercy, and Reason. It was some weeks before the full consequences of that grey October morning at Ashcombe Close had worked themselves out, and I set them down here in the order in which they reached us, rather than the order of their happening, for such is generally the way in which the aftermath of a case unfolds, not as a single closing scene, but as a slow settling of dust over a wide and troubled field. Agnes Bell's true affidavit, recovered whole and unaltered from Julian Fane's document case, was delivered to the parliamentary inquiry within the week, and its effect was everything Sir Matthew had spent 20 years labouring to prevent. Caleb Wade was cleared, posthumously and without qualification, of the charge that had sent him to his grave still protesting his innocence. The railway company, faced with evidence it could no longer suppress or discredit, issued a formal acceptance of responsibility for the Blackthorn deaths, and I understand that a modest memorial now stands at the junction itself, though I have not seen it with my own eyes. Sir Matthew's charities did not fall, as Eleanor had once feared they might, into ruin. They passed instead under the administration of independent trustees, their good work continuing, I am told, quite undiminished by the disgrace of the man who had founded them for such mingled reasons. Eleanor herself refused absolutely the portion of her inheritance that could be traced, however indirectly, to the Blackthorn case, and used it instead to establish a fund in Caleb Wade's own name for the education of railway workers' children, a gesture I thought entirely in keeping with the quiet, unbending honesty I had first glimpsed in her, across a breakfast table she had not wished to sit at. Thomas Wade was not, in the end, prosecuted for the false confession he had offered so readily, in the hope of protecting a woman he believed guilty of nothing worse than fear. Holmes appeared before the appropriate authorities and demonstrated with the same care he had shown in unravelling the case itself that Thomas had neither switched the fatal affidavit nor caused Sir Matthew's death by any act of his own. His removal of a document from the dispatch box and his subsequent silence as to its whereabouts were recorded as an obstruction of the investigation, but the leniency of the sentence that followed reflected, I think, a general and unspoken understanding of the grief that had prompted it. Julian Fane was convicted of murder, though the trial that followed was unlike any I had previously attended in Holmes's company. The full history of Sir Matthew's coercion, the threat against Fane's late father, the 20 years of secret restitution to Wade's family, the letter that would have named Fane the sole architect of a crime he had been compelled, not chosen, to commit, was laid before the court in careful detail, precisely as Holmes had insisted it should be. The law found him guilty. I do not think any honest observer of the proceedings could have concluded otherwise, for a man had died by his hand, deliberately and with considerable design. But the sentence that followed, weighed against the whole circumstance of his long and complicated guilt, was tempered in a manner that I believe reflected credit upon the court, and upon the country whose law it served. It was some days after the trial had concluded, on an evening when a fog lay thick along Baker Street and the fire burned low in our sitting room, that I put to Holmes a question that had troubled me since the moment of Fane's arrest. "Do you pity him, Holmes?" He was some while in answering, his pipe drawing slowly, his eyes fixed upon the coals in the particular manner that told me he was giving the question his full and serious consideration, rather than the swift glancing attention he reserved for matters he judged unworthy of it. "Pity and judgment are not opposites, Watson, whatever the sentimental fiction of the age would have us believe," he said at last. "Reason determines what a man has done. It is a cold instrument, and I have found it, on the whole, a reliable one. But mercy determines how fully the punishment that follows should account for why he did it. And that is a different question altogether, and no less important for being harder to answer with any certainty. You believe, then, that Fane deserved mercy. I believe he deserved to be understood before he was condemned, which is not quite the same thing, though the two are often mistaken for one another. A court that convicts without understanding convicts blindly, whatever justice it believes itself to be serving. A court that understands without convicting serves no justice at all. Fane's crime was real, Watson, and Sir Matthew's death was no less a murder for having grown out of 20 years of accumulated wrong. But the seed of that wrong was planted by another hand, long before Fane's own hand closed upon the poison, and I do not think the law is well served by pretending otherwise, whatever comfort such pretence might offer to those who prefer their villains simple. I sat with this some while, turning it over as I had turned over so many of his conclusions across the years of our acquaintance, and I found myself thinking not of Fane alone, nor even of Sir Matthew, but of the whole strange architecture of the case, of a household built upon such scrupulous order that it had, in the end, concealed a disorder 20 years deep and 3 consciences wide. "I have been thinking, Holmes," I said, "that the law failed once already in this affair, when it accepted a false affidavit 20 years ago, and sent an innocent man to die still protesting his innocence, and yet I cannot help but feel it would have failed again, quite as badly, had it declined to pursue a murder simply because the victim proved, upon examination, to have been a man of such compromised virtue." "That," said Holmes, knocking the ash from his pipe, "is very nearly the whole lesson of the case, set down more plainly than I could have managed myself." I have thought often, since that evening, of the uneasy lesson Ashcombe Close left with me, that truth, once pursued to its proper end, will expose the sins of the respectable quite as readily as it exposes the buried virtues of the guilty, and that justice, if it is to survive at all as something more than mere procedure, must be willing to look steadily at both. It is not a comfortable conclusion, and I do not think Holmes intended it to be one. But I have found, in the years that have followed, that the truest cases are rarely the comfortable ones, and that a lesson which leaves no unease behind it has generally not been learned deeply enough to matter.